I still think this is unexpected, and it's certainly encouraging for the Ukrainians and I think some of the European allies to think that maybe there's a small possibility that Trump really will roll up his sleeves and finally put some pressure on Putin.
Hello, I'm Anna Smith and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm joined today by John Lough, Head of Foreign Policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. John, thank you so much for joining me. We saw President Trump address the UN General Assembly yesterday. I think it's fair to say his comments afterwards on his Truth Social platform are the ones that have really caught people's attention. Him saying Ukraine could get back the original borders from where this war started. This is quite a big shift from him, isn't it?
It's a huge shift. He's never said anything like this before, and it's unclear, what exactly has influenced him on this occasion. But it really does sound as though President Zelensky's got his ear this time, and it possibly also reflects the fact that Trump is doubtless very frustrated with President Putin because he's put enormous effort into trying to befriend Putin, sort of cajole him, flatter him. Bring him out of international isolation. That meeting in Anchorage, Trump had to invest a lot of capital in that. And he's got absolutely nothing for it so far. So is he, in this case, changing tack in order to try to influence Putin? I think what many people expect is that he'll do another call with Putin and then change his line completely. And then possibility that he'll blame the Ukrainians again for starting the war. You just don't know. But I still think this is unexpected, and it's certainly encouraging for the Ukrainians and I think some of the European allies to think that maybe there's a small possibility that Trump really will roll up his sleeves and finally put some pressure on Putin. But I would add a note of caution here because he hasn't shown any sign of doing this so far. He's talked about more severe sanctions being imposed on Russia by stopping oil exports from or sanctioning countries buying Russian oil, notably India and China. Of course, he's put sanctions on India, I suspect for reasons other than the fact they're buying oil from Russia. But he wants the Europeans and all the NATO countries to line up and make this a concerted, consolidated effort. And that's simply not going to happen. And he knows that full well. So I felt all along he's trying to actually shift the burden of responsibility onto Europe. And he can blame the Europeans by saying they don't want to do these sanctions the way I would like to do them, and we all have to do them together. But maybe, just maybe, something has slightly shifted now, and he's going to have a rethink. And he made an also, I thought, very significant statement yesterday about Russian aircraft, military aircraft entering the airspace of NATO countries, that they should be shot down. And that left Secretary of State Marco Rubio, I think, really having to backpedal because he'd been among those, I suspect, who probably instinctively felt that would be the right thing to say and do, provided the Russians, of course, are warned of the danger this might happen, but had felt that his boss would not want to get into that situation. Therefore, the statement issued by NATO yesterday, by NATO standards, was relatively strong, but it didn't go the ultimate, I suppose, the whole way, and say, look, if this happens again, we are going to shoot down a Russian aircraft. I don't think there was any chance that NATO would say that explicitly. You've got to sort of read between the lines of what they're saying. But obviously there are a number of member states who feel very strongly about this, notably Poland and the Balts and a few others in the region. And I suppose Trump's statement yesterday to them would be quite encouraging. It would suggest that he is still invested in NATO, because the real concern is that the United States, of course, is no longer committed in the way that it was previously.
Can I ask you about Zelensky's tone? Obviously, they had this meeting, and in February he was thrown out of the White House, and yet yesterday he's hailing Trump as a game changer. What do you make of that?
Well, Zelensky's got a big battle on his hands, of course, to keep the country fighting. And so far, Ukraine's showing no signs of buckling as the way the Kremlin would probably expect it to, given the level of pressure it's under. And you have to just look at these daily assaults, the drone attacks that are taking place on a much more prolific scale. So he needs every ounce of encouragement he can get from the Western allies. And of course, his big problem has been with the Trump administration. And as you rightly recall, February was, when that meeting took place, was a real disaster for Zelensky personally. But he didn't give up. He relied heavily on the Europeans to make his case and to try to soften Trump's very clear antagonism towards him. And that seems to have worked to a quite significant degree. I mean, that image of them speaking together in the Vatican, do you remember that at the Pope's funeral, was actually quite striking because Trump seemed to be listening rather than lecturing or hectoring Zelensky. And that, these images can be quite powerful sometimes. So I think for the purposes of Zelensky's domestic challenge, and also his need to show to the European allies, who are his strongest supporters here, that he's done everything possible to overcome this communication problem with the White House and Trump personally. I mean, I think that's very important. So yesterday, he wanted to capitalize on that. And for him, that's something probably of a personal victory, that he feels he's finally got Trump's attention by showing him what the Ukrainians are doing. And remember that famous line in at the catastrophic Oval Office meeting where Trump said, "You've got no cards, and Putin's in charge here, and you're just going to have to accept his terms." I mean, that was the subtext of what Trump was saying. This time round, he's sort of implying that Ukraine has actually plenty of cards, and he's possibly been influenced by the successful air campaign the Ukrainians have been conducting against some oil assets, oil refineries, oil terminals in Russia, which are undoubtedly having some sort of effect. I don't think one should over-dramatize this. They've probably disabled something like 15, perhaps even 20% of Russia's refining capacity. And the Russians are able to repair some of this quite quickly. But where the Ukrainians, I think, have shown great ingenuity and considerable, maybe, progress in the development of their drone warfare, and developed also some new missile systems, is that they can strike these targets more frequently. And because they can strike them more frequently, it means that it's more difficult for the Russians to repair them and get that capacity back online. So the Ukrainian strategy here is to try to bring the war home to the Russian population. And shortages of petrol, for example, are manifesting themselves in some parts of the country. As far as I can tell, this is still quite relatively isolated, but it is becoming a problem. And possibly Trump has been persuaded that actually the Ukrainians have got more in the tank than I ever imagined. And these strikes actually on the two oil terminals on the Baltic are really quite significant, because the national pipeline company Transneft has had to tell the oil producers to, as far as I understand it, to limit production because the pipelines are full and they can't get the usual volumes out. So that sort of thing does create complications, and it's clear that the Russian economy is hurting from this level of sanctions. I mean, it just has to, given the scale of them. They can't just compensate by trading much more with China or other parts of the world. And the Russians have made it clear many times they'd like the sanctions lifted. So they are undoubtedly having an effect, but it's a very slow burn effect. So my assumption is that this war is going to continue for some time yet, because neither side is really at the stage where it feels that it has to get to the negotiating table. And it may be that Trump is now recognizing this and thinking, at least, and some of the people around him thinking perhaps more creatively about the type of pressure that they could put on Putin to try to bring this war to an end. So I think that's where we are at the moment. But I think all sides recognizing that this is going to continue into 2026.
In terms of everything you've just said, so we know that Trump has this long record of changing his position in order to gain leverage. But he also does like backing a winner. So where are we at in terms of, do you think it is that he realizes that there needs to be a long way to go before there's going to be any more kind of negotiation, or is it that he's listened to what's happening and he thinks, actually, I need to be on the right side of this?
I think it's more a question of him perhaps reevaluating the situation, asking himself why Putin isn't playing ball. He thought he could get into a long tango with Putin and do some great things together and mend US-Russia relations, get business investing both ways, dreams of these sort of joint projects, and then he could notch up what would be the eighth war that he'd ended. People talk the whole time about his Nobel Peace Prize aspirations, and I suspect that those are real. He still seems to be frustrated that Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize and he hasn't succeeded so far. But he's invested deeply in this, and for him not to be able to achieve a result is extremely frustrating. But his problem is that with the MAGA base, and he's vowed that the US is not going to be drawn into these distant conflicts and these sort of entangling alliances. So how does he realistically put this pressure on Putin? And the only way it seems to me that he can really do this, according to his calculations, is economically. He's quite happy for the European allies of Ukraine to buy US weaponry, although there are indications that US is rationing weapon supplies at the moment, both to NATO allies and probably indirectly also to Ukraine. But to keep Ukraine in the fight, it has to be supplied with weaponry. It needs, of course, this sort of international broader support, and it needs financing. And it could be, the war could be costing anything between $100 billion and $150 billion dollars a year to keep going. So that's a lot to ask for. But of course, a number of the European allies of Ukraine are well aware that if we don't make this investment, we might be paying in other ways far greater amounts in much more acute conditions. So they want to avoid that. So this is all, I think, finely balanced. Maybe Trump can see what, in my view, is the case at the moment, which is neither side is actually winning. For all the Russians' superiority in terms of men, equipment, the superior defense industrial base, they've not been able to bring this pressure to bear on Ukraine to such an extent that Ukraine is about to put up the white flag. The Ukrainians are hurting in lots and lots of ways. They've got still a very serious manpower problem when it comes to just staffing the armed forces. Economically, with the help of the European Union and probably IMF as well, they can stagger on, but nobody knows really how long they can just, I suppose, sustain this level of resistance and resilience. So what we didn't possibly expect was that Ukraine would be able to strike into Russia so effectively, and this brings a new dimension to the war. This war is evolving the whole time. And equally, we probably might not have expected the Russians would have got up to speed so quickly in terms of drone warfare, because other aspects of the Russian war fighting machine are really pretty antiquated and not working very well. But when it comes to drones, the Russians are doing well. So no clear, certainly no winner emerging clearly at the moment. And that would suggest for Trump, well, the problem is because nobody is about to get down on their knees and beg for peace, that means it's going to go on for a while. So how do I then alter the calculation? Because I still think he wants to be able to deliver on this. Because in terms of his electorate, he's made specific commitments. He's been super confident throughout about his ability to persuade both sides that they can stop this. And of course, if he was successful, it would be a huge feather in his cap. So he's a man who doesn't, it seems, give up easily. And maybe some of those people who know him better, there are, I think, some of those commentating on Times radioing have been saying that he's capable of flipping when he doesn't see he's getting the desired result from one side. But the problem here is that all of us analysts, we face this difficulty that we're almost sort of analysing the world and what might happen next on the basis of the latest statement from Trump, and that's a danger. I think we just have to look at the facts here. That this is a war that shows no sign of stopping, and if President Trump's arsenal is limited, and he doesn't want to get the US directly involved, he doesn't want to be paying for support to Ukraine, then there are certain constraints here in terms of his vision of what he can deliver.
I was going to say, presumably it was expected from all sides that Russia would come out today, as they have, saying, there is no alternative to a continued invasion. That is what we're going to do.
Yeah, well, Putin has made this very clear, that if they can't achieve their objectives through negotiations, then they'll achieve them by military means. He said that quite explicitly. And I think he's trying to suggest to Trump that the Ukrainians don't want to play ball, that the Russians have quite reasonable requirements here for bringing the war to an end, and the Ukrainians won't engage. And I said Zelensky could come to Moscow. That was when Trump was trying to insist that Putin and Zelensky had to get together. And I think Zelensky said all along, I'm prepared to do this, but he's certainly not prepared to go to Moscow to do it, which I think is totally understandable on his part.
Completely. You mentioned it earlier as well. I just wanted to talk about it a little bit more. The other comments that Trump made yesterday about the shooting down Russian planes. How significant do you think that is?
I think it's important in the case, I suppose, of the dynamics between the NATO member states. The Europeans are petrified that the US is in fact no longer there, that NATO is effectively an empty shell. And yes, it still exists on paper, but if push comes to a shove, the US won't be there. They just won't show up. And so that once that belief settles within an organization, once it's perceived as not having the same power that it possessed previously, then it becomes, in Trump's words, as he described Russia yesterday, a paper tiger. And that's I think the difficulty that the Europeans face at the moment. They've tried desperately to keep Trump on board, and it's really required humiliating themselves on some occasions, and the NATO summit was a fine example of that. And very choreographed event just to ensure that Trump didn't misspeak and kill the alliance on the spot. But so far they've been able to keep up at least the appearance of the US being committed to NATO. I was actually quite struck by the statement made by Mike Waltz, the new US ambassador to the UN, who made his maiden speech yesterday. And he was very strong on the US commitment to NATO. The US and its allies, he said, would defend every inch of alliance territory. And he is perhaps one of those who belongs to the camp that sees value in NATO and the continued US commitment to NATO, provided that the Europeans spend what they should be spending on their investment in the alliance. And so Trump has obviously felt, I think, quite enthused by his success in persuading the Europeans they have no option but to invest much more. I mean, increasing their overall investment up to 5% of GDP, which is a massive increase, including for the UK. And how sustainable that commitment will be is quite another matter. But I think for that, and I'm quite sure there is a faction around Trump, advisors and others who believe that NATO does still bring value for the US. And if it brings value, then you've got to stand by it, and you've certainly got to persuade both your allies and your potential adversaries, that you're still there, and therefore NATO is a force to be reckoned with. So I actually personally read more into the statement by Waltz yesterday, because I felt that that's something that's been prepared. It's not off the cuff. With Trump, it's so much off the cuff. So that's where we are today, but where will we be tomorrow or next week is quite another matter. I suspect that the Russians will think twice now about another 12-minute incursion into the airspace of one of the Baltic states. I think they've got a message here. Whether that message is strong enough to deter them from doing some other things, or maybe just occasionally cutting a corner when Russian fighters fly from the Russian mainland to the exclave of Kaliningrad, they might just fly over a bit of Estonia for 30 seconds. That stuff might continue. Equally, some of this, so-called, hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, these other things, I suspect will persist. But the question is the extent to which they will conduct them, and just what sort of impact they might be looking to get. It's one thing to just kind of needle and persuade people that you're still there. It's quite another thing to trigger a crisis. So I suspect they will, for the moment, tread a little bit more carefully.
You said it yourself. We can never quite anticipate what President Trump is going to do next. Zelensky himself said he was surprised by this latest move by him. In summary, do you think it could be a ray of hope or a potential just false dawn here again?
Well, I think there is possibly a ray of hope there, because Trump's hit a brick wall with Putin, and he's got to rethink. And that, for that reason, I think the Ukrainians can justifiably expect there'll be some maybe review of what Trump has to do next. And he's shown no sign so far of wanting to back out of this, although there is a possibility that he might just get so frustrated he'll say, I can't do this anymore, it's over to you Europeans. But we're, I think, still far from that. Could it be a false dawn? Possibly. But I would suspect that the White House is going to spend a bit of time assessing its options now. And I think it's also significant in Europe that the question of these frozen Russian assets is also moving, the $200 billion that are in Europe, that the Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, has come up with this really quite smart idea of not confiscating the assets as such, but effectively lending them, or a portion of them, to Ukraine, which will be offset against future reparations from Russia. So that technically that might, because the lawyers have been very worried about the precedent set here for the confiscation of assets, that might be a way out of the situation. So, if suddenly 200 billion is mobilized for the purpose of supporting Ukraine, and the Europeans have shown the courage to do that, finally, then I think that might, also impact on the way the Americans view the situation. And they can see that actually there are resources here for Ukraine to support Ukraine's continued resistance. And that maybe changes the calculation.
John, thank you so much for joining me, as ever. An absolute pleasure to listen to your expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thanks a lot.